Session, and thank you, Michael, for agreeing to deliver this session. Before we start, I'm just going to give a brief introduction of Michael and his work. Michael Bunce is an educator and interdisciplinary artist whose work is located at the intersection of learning, design and innovation, interdisciplinary arts practice and learning, and technological innovation. Michael currently leads the Masters in Global Learning Futures and the Masters in Sound and Music at UEL, and he's also the Curriculum Development and Enhancement Lead. Since 2019, he's also led the Meta-Praxis project with ISA in Adelaide and has acted as a critical friend to Charles Leadbeater's agency Lab. Michael and Charles will be co-leading the Learning Impact project in Adelaide between 2022 and 2024. Michael has taught, presented and performed for universities and arts organisations in the UK and Europe, North and South America and Australia, as well as working as a music director for the National Youth Theatre and as creative designer and project lead for the National Trust, a senior tutor for the Drake Music Project, and as independent composer, music producer and interdisciplinary artist. So we're very, very pleased that he could join us today to deliver this session. And without further ado, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Melissa, and welcome all. It's really good to have you here with us today. Welcome to those of you joining us externally and also to colleagues at UEL. Thank you for all of you for being here. This session is a real privilege to be able to deliver, and colleagues in KELP who I've worked with in the past have really been very supportive of the kind of work that I'm going to present today. Looking at ways in which we might enhance student agency and look at ways in which we might make the curriculum more dynamic to be perhaps more interdisciplinary in the way that we work. And that's certainly something that the University of East London has been championing for a few years now. And what I hope to be able to share today with you is a sort of a trajectory of work that began in around 2015 in the development of a performing arts degree, all the way through to a project now that shares some of this work in Australia, and looping back to look at the way that this is then becoming further developed in our music department at UEL in the School of Arts and Creative Industries. So the idea behind the session, and I'm sorry to repeat some of the abstract or the intro to that, but I must also first of all share my screen. So give me a moment. So the idea behind this presentation is to look at how we might enable agency for students, for teachers, for lecturers, and through learning design. And in the music writing and performance department at UEL, for both undergraduate and postgraduate courses, we've been leading curriculum delivery using a dynamic interdisciplinary curriculum design and project-based learning approach. And this approach enables courses to respond and adapt to the curriculum, to adapt the curriculum to changing features and the needs of the professional context and the market as well. So it's not only adaptive to the external market, but also internally adaptive to the needs of students, and also, as I will describe later on, adaptive to the ways in which our external partners who are taking on some of our curriculum are able to respond to their markets as well. So these partnerships that we have with specialised learning organisations, part of a sort of learning ecosystem, are supported by this dynamic curriculum approach. And this is something I'm going to go into much more detail about later on and to show how that works. There's a flexibility in the approach that offers opportunities also for students to design their own project work, which is something I'll look at towards the end of the presentation. And through the presentation, I'll put in two opportunities for some questions and answers as we go, so that we can discuss together and deliberate some of the issues that are emerging from this work as we go. So welcome all. We'll move through to look at the key areas of discussion within that scope. So after an introduction really to the way in which this work has developed, I'll look through concepts of agency, concepts of disciplinarity, thinking about the ways in which we might move from disciplinary to interdisciplinary to transdisciplinary and even metadisciplinary approaches to learning. Then I'll showcase the dynamic interdisciplinary project design and look at how that works, both locally for us at UEL within our music department, but also then how that works for partners and onwards. And then we'll look at some meta-curricular design concepts. So the idea behind that is that the design work that we've put in place within the music department then is scaled to external partners and scaled to ways in which we might teach, let's say in inverted commas, the curriculum design process itself, that learning design process, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on in relation to the Masters in Global Learning Futures, which is a course I program lead. We'll look at the concept of learning ecosystems, thinking about interdependent partnerships between different learning organisations, whether they're universities, hubs at the centre of the learning ecosystem, or whether it's a much more distributed approach where individual partnerships might exist with practitioners as much as learning organisations. So we might look at the way that recording studios are connected into a fabric or a network of partnerships with learning organisations and so on. So that looking at the professional context for the work. I'll also demonstrate a project system during the session today, which is one of the ways in which we are sort of coordinating this interdisciplinary scope and making its dynamism sort of practical and manageable, which that's one of the tensions in this work, is that the more dynamic we are, the harder it is for our systems to potentially, unless they're redesigned, to accommodate that kind of dynamic approach. And finally, as I've said, we'll get into some discussion around the opportunity for students to direct the process of learning design and curriculum design. The way I like to think about that is thinking about, changing the rules of the game as one of its moves. So there's a real opportunity to kind of think about this as at a meta level of curriculum design. What if students are able, in their own scope, to design their own curricula, and as well as think about designing their own project outcomes as part of that. So the work began in 2015 with a BA in Performing Arts, which was designed to incorporate a range of fairly closely related disciplines. So thinking about dancers, choreographers, lighting designers, sound designers, collaborating with actors and musicians and actor musicians and so on. So the broad context was one of performing arts and staged performance predominantly. And there was the curriculum design there needed to find a sort of language for assessment that would enable us to capture the learning and the impact of that learning for students coherently within that assessment language. Subsequently, the university developed a new curriculum framework across the entire university, and as part of the music department, the music writing and performance department, sorry, within the School of Arts and Creative Industries, we developed a project-based approach, which almost enabled us to work in a way that maintained our practice, but also really capitalized on the opportunity to work with a creative arts practice sort of paradigm, thinking about a pattern of development, which I'll talk a bit about later on. So we're able to use the module structure in the new framework really to catalyze the way in which we could be creative and apply our skills in context, which is what we were very keen to maintain. The work that went into that curriculum design and the preceding work with performing arts then led to sharing it externally, both in Melbourne, for the University of Melbourne, and then subsequently in Adelaide with the Association for Independent Schools for South Australia. And that then led to the establishment of the Meta Praxis project. And this is a project that I'm just culminating now, and the idea in this project was that I would work with 12 schools in and around Adelaide to support them in the leadership of their own curriculum innovation projects, modelled in some way on the approaches that we've taken at UEL. And then from that, another scale up, this sort of meta-curricular concept, was that we would be able to accredit that process by instituting the Masters in Global Learning Futures, so that teachers involved in embedded projects within their schools, for example, would be able to then have their work accredited as part of a postgraduate qualification. So that's the trajectory of the work, and there's much to talk about, and I will only be able to talk about some of it. I would be very good to continue the conversation with others of you, those of you that are interested, further from this. So the first thing that I really wanted to look at was the concept of agency, given that we've talked about this being an opportunity to enhance agency for students. So agency is very much about being and becoming, from my point of view, and this quote is taken from a paper that's being released reflecting on the Meta Practice project. So agency is about being and becoming. It's an emergent property of our experience in the world and a determining factor in the quality of that experience. What or who actively or passively controls the scope and depth of that determination, or how the environment or its context may enable or constrain agency for individuals and collectives, can be described by the locus of control. And that locus of control, the scope of this really is to incorporate primary, secondary schools as well as tertiary level organisations. But we might think about this as a general shift towards personalised learning, where we're considering who is directing the learning process. And in that, there's a sort of spectrum here that I've set out that begins with a kind of model of top-down regulation, where our systems are the things that determine the content of our learning, but also then the structures of that learning, so the curriculum structure, the way in which progression occurs for students. And so that journey in a very sort of top-down regulated view, and we might well be talking about a previous version of education in many cases in this case, in relation to this. But it's also characterized by static approaches where the content of learning is fixed, the structures of learning, the curriculum structures are fixed, so the context in which they occur might be fixed. And in many ways, the skills that we attribute to those types of learning processes are also fixed. And in that case, we sort of propagate uniformity, we're finding similarity in assessment that's common. And we might think of that as a sort of convergence of learners in one homogeneous group as a whole. Now that's I don't want to present a sort of binary view because I don't think that's necessarily where schools and universities are at the moment. But if we look then along this spectrum, where we might then start to look at how the system and the teacher interact and the teacher and the student interact, as we move towards the end of that spectrum, we can start to notice greater degrees of agency in learning, where students are co-creating with teachers potentially, where students are working peer-to-peer, and where students are then self-directing their own learning. The extent to which they self-direct, I'm sort of presenting here this idea that it's not just about the concept of their project or the context for the projects that they might deliver, but very much also the structure of their learning process, and that we as teachers or lecturers should be facilitators, inspirers, people who are able to create enabling environments rather than those who carry out the process of the curriculum structure or only carry out the process of the curriculum structure. So in that view, where students are self-directing, we end up with a whole group of different individuals, as if we didn't have that to begin with. And so in that space, we're, that end of the spectrum, we are recognizing the dynamic quality of learning. We're recognizing diversity in learning, and rather than looking for similarity in the assessments or the products of the learning process, we're looking for equivalence. So there's a notion that we might be, looking at the impact of the work across multiple domains rather than only thinking about the reflection of a predetermined model back to us in the process of assessment. And so we then end up, thinking about this divergence of the curriculum, divergence of the learning process, by giving students greater levels of agency in their experience. And as Melissa pointed to, the work that I've been doing in the Meta-Praxis project with ASA in Adelaide has also correlated with work by Charles Leadbeater around student agency, and I've acted as a critical friend to his project, working with student agency lab schools. And I won't go through lots of detail here, but I'm happy to provide this paper that's recently been released by the Centre for Strategic Education in Melbourne, in which Charlie sort of outlines the different ways in which we might think about agency taking a role in our learning. And so learning on purpose, this concept of purposeful learning, focusing on dynamic capabilities, not just skills that are fixed and embedded in a particular discipline, let's say, that we consider the way in which we deal with the philosophy, the products, and the practice of learning, and think about that as an oscillation, a kind of, a changing quantity, a changing quantity. That students bring this to life, and that's very much one of the kind of central concepts of the presentation today, is that, that students bring the curriculum to life. It's not just about them operating as sort of agents within the containers of the curriculum structure, so much as the way in which we give them agency, or provide the content, the opportunity for them to exercise their own agency in the design of their learning pathways. Thinking also about teacher agency, lecturer agency, thinking about the ways in which we are able to act with purpose within the system, to create new patterns, to create new ways of learning. And this also then relates to the idea of how we recognize or assess, in old terminology, but this idea that how we might recognize learning and the various ways in which learning occurs and has impact. And in this case, we're thinking about agency. So where do we look for it? How do we find it? Where do we see agency, opportunities for agency for students and teachers and within the system? And where the system needs to change, there are strategies for enacting that change that Charlie looks at in this paper. And he talks about the power of narrative, that telling stories of our learning, of our teaching process, of our change processes is something that's really central and core to that. And that in the final chapter, he talks about whole school leadership. So I will definitely add that to the chat at an appropriate point, along with the paper that I wrote to reflect upon the Meta-Praxis project that's released this month as well. So within the scope of the Meta-Praxis project, but also at all of the other levels that I've described, thinking back to the Performing Arts degree, and the opportunity for the new framework at UEL offered, and then through to the Masters in Global Learning Futures. We've been working with this concept of disciplinarity. So the disciplinary practice is where disciplinary skills are developed within defined areas of practice. Multidisciplinary practice is where independent disciplines collaborate on their own terms, but with limited integration. A good example of that might be where we might look at a theatre production, thinking about the Performing Arts degree, where each of the individual participants in that collaboration have their own fairly well-defined areas of practice. And there is limited integration, but again, that integration is very well defined. When we move into interdisciplinary practice, then we're looking at integration, where we're creating combinations of collective forms of practice. And that can then develop further so that we get to transdisciplinary modes, where the integration of disciplinary domains then establishes new modes and forms that transcend original disciplinary models, to the extent that we end up with hybrid disciplinary models, and that those are sort of an amalgam or a distribution, depending on whatever metaphor you want to sort of go with. But the idea is there's an interconnectedness in this new hybrid form. The concept of metadisciplinarity is one that brings greater levels of agency and reflexive practice for students. The idea is that the meta is the reflexive part. It's metacognitive, it's also self-referential, and this reflexive approach to disciplinary practice acknowledges that students will develop expertise in the integration, leveraging and transfer of disciplinary skills and knowledge, and that they are then able to apply that and apply those skill sets relative to context in a way that is completely independent. So they're acting autonomously with agency to decide what the content, the context and modes of learning are for particular contexts. Now, one of the temptations is to think of this as a sort of linear scale where we start as disciplinarians and then we move to the expert metadisciplinary space. But the table is sort of disconcerting, is moving us away from what really should be a dynamic process, something of an oscillation, so that sometimes we can act as disciplinary specialists, other times we're moving into a much more exploratory or emergent kind of metadisciplinary way of working. And the opportunity to provide students with the understanding of that is really strong, I think. So the more we're able to support students in kind of reflecting metacognitively on their own process and what's relevant at different points in time, whether this is in primary school, secondary school, or in tertiary contexts, it is very valuable. So then we might think about how these contexts of disciplinarity enable us to be more dynamic in the way that we deal with concepts of agency, and also transfer. So thinking about transfer as the idea about how we are able to take our knowledge and skills and apply them in different contexts to derive new meaning. So we can look at this as a scale where, if we're thinking about transfer as being explicit, so a teaching model which is about transmitting skills, transmitting knowledge in a perhaps a didactic approach, we might be in a disciplinary space in some way. So there's there's content and there's contexts that we need to discover as part of that are fixed and bound by that disciplinary context. But as we move then towards more multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, trans and metadisciplinary approaches, there's more focus placed on our skills, skills of interpretation, the ways in which we might be able to problem solve and make choices about the way that we're learning given different scenarios and contexts. And likewise for agency. So we can see that overall, going from a disciplinary space where we have structured and predominantly static or sequential relationships between the content, context and modes of learning, with increasingly self-directed learning, we're able to apply skills and knowledge more dynamically relative to the content and the contexts of our learning, to become much more autonomous, reflective and dynamic in the way that we leverage skills and knowledge for lots of different types of contexts in the way that we're working. So what's all this about? Well, the idea is, in many ways, that we're looking for ways to be dynamic in the way that we not only learn or practice as practitioners, arts practitioners, let's say, but also the way that we think about the structuring, and that it isn't a kind of incremental process of building disciplinary skill necessarily before we become experts in being able to transfer it. It's a much more integrated, dynamic process of being able to move from different spaces, but with greater awareness of what that means for us as learners, and likewise in partnership as teachers and learners, or as learners and learners. So just to give an example, the opportunity of this framework is that we are able to derive new patterns for learning, and how we make connections in a way that is very open and exploratory is something I'll look at now in terms of the BA in Performing Arts that we first developed. So one way of establishing coherence in interdisciplinary practice, where subjects may not speak quite the same language, is to find a meta-type, a kind of meta-language that can speak the languages of a given range of disciplines meaningfully and equally. And in the BA in Performing Arts, I used Newtonian physics as a sort of metaphorical concept and language framework to hold the range of practice for actors, for dancers, for choreographers, lighting designers, sound designers, and so on and so forth. So I won't go through that whole list again, but so in the module Energy and Momentum, this sort of metatypical language, this meta language, enabled an inclusive way of assessing performance across those different disciplines. So, for example, we're asking students to demonstrate skills in mediating force, resistance, and flow as an individual performer. And so in that case, it's across dance, movement, all those different disciplines I've talked about. The idea is that that mediation of force, resistance, and flow can apply to a choreographer, a dancer, a lighting designer, a sound designer, a composer, an actor, musician, because it's thinking about how energy is distributed over time and through interaction. So here we have demonstrating evidence skills in the dynamic structuring of sound and music, movement, narrative, staging, lighting, so on, and develop and apply skills and tools in sustaining energy and momentum in devising a performance practice. So you can see that the language doesn't say play an instrument to this level or create a dance with these structural features. It's very much finding a kind of, as I say, finding this sort of meta level that enables an inclusive way of speaking about all of those things. And the question then is, well, where does the specificity come in? And I think what I would show in some of the work here is that the specificity comes where we start to develop our rubrics, and it comes when we have assessment criteria. So we might have different sets of assessment criteria that speak a more specific language to each of these different subject areas, where the learning outcomes or the learning intentions are within a kind of structure that is or spoken in a language that is much more inclusive. And sorry, I'm jumping ahead. So that was the initial spark, I suppose, of the idea, is this approach to finding an inclusive language, in some cases using a discipline as the concept system itself. So we have other module titles like time and space. We're looking at sort of concepts of quantum reality and hauntology, thinking about the sort of a concept of futures past, the futures of the. Anyway, I won't get too into that detail, otherwise we'll be here forever, or not. So that's one example. That's this way in which we were able to find a kind of meta language to hold diversity, to hold this interdisciplinary space. And the second example I'll speak about now is this idea of the interdisciplinary curriculum design as part of a new framework. The key features of our sound and music suite of programs are really, we were keen for them to be very industry focused, to be ideas focused, to feature a whole range of transferable skills, and to really be largely about creative enterprise and collaboration, so that the experience for students was very much about a live, industry-oriented project base. And what we had in the framework was, new modules that were really beginning to start to think about collaboration in general terms, or starting to think about the ways in which we could, come together as a group or a cluster of different courses to experience the same modules. One of the things that challenged us with, as areas of, in the music writing and performance area, was that we did have different disciplinary areas of practice that were specific, and we wanted to hold on to those. And so we had to find a way to perform the same trick in some ways. So find this sort of meta level of coherence that enabled us to maintain our disciplinary specificity, but at the same time take advantage of our collaborative and interdisciplinary opportunity. And so the idea of collaborative interdisciplinary projects is what we wanted to do. We wanted to capture our practice and maintain it. So this is very much focused on the sound and music area at the moment. But the idea was that was the primary experience for students and needed to continue to be. So the types of skills I talked about, I'm going to sort of jump across, but just pick out some of these as key ideas. This idea that these cross-disciplinary competencies, like adaptability and critical thinking, for example, needed to be a primary focus. the ways in which we could be fluent across disciplines need to be a primary focus. So these were some of the core areas that we wanted to nurture in student work as well. So again, things that were transversal, sitting across disciplines rather than only working in a kind of linear way through them. And the way in which we managed this was to create a kind of metatypical module pattern based on the creative arts workflow. This idea that we'd have skills, then integrated through collaborative project work, and then applied in professional contexts, and that pattern was this would sit underneath interdisciplinary project work, so that what you find then is that the disciplinary content sits within or floats across these modules in industry-oriented applied projects. So these were providing a kind of framework for skills development, for collaboration and applied practice, but the content would sit within the project, and the project would be dynamic. So you can see here a model where there are 4 notional projects that sit across this pattern of modules, and the idea is that we would use learning outcome language that was again a sort of a meta language that could describe practice across multiple disciplines. Now, one criticism of that could be that talking about it as a meta language is all good and well, but what if it feels too generic? And that's one of the tensions in this, is that making sure that we still have enough specificity in the way that we use our disciplinary specific language within assessment criteria and within the rubrics that we're establishing, and that then gives us the focus for each discipline, but at the same time we have this meta language that can describe across those disciplines. So as an example, we might say then that we ask students to analyse and evaluate emergent modes of collaboration in their own multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary projects, making reference to the work of key practitioners. Now that can work across dance, music, drama and applied theatre, performing arts, because it's inclusive of that project work, or it's generic enough to hold that practice. And then within that, the language of the assessment criteria and the rubric would give us more specificity. You'll see in this pattern that across all levels, from level 3 to level 6, we're able to kind of maintain the green blocks, which were the skills modules, and then collaboration existed all the way through, and again, apply was a sort of module strand that's about applied practice. So we maintain this pattern, and within that pattern then we're able to establish different projects. So for example, in sound and music, we have projects in level 4, producing an electronic press kit, imaginary production, sound design of the environment, creative project portfolio production, and so on. So a range of these projects inherit learning outcomes from each of those modules, and then articulate that in terms of the professional context and in terms of the language of the assessment criteria to make that specific to a particular way of working, whether that's around sound design or linear recording methods, or looking at sound design for adaptive contexts and games design, for example. And the idea was that portfolios, multimodal portfolios, so interactive versions of these online, would be a way of kind of holding this assemblage of different project work, and that students would then be able to build or develop a professional portfolio to showcase their work as they move from level 3 all the way through to level 7, and that was again a reflective process, a dynamic process for the students in their development. So I'm just going to pause at this point and then sort of take us to the next meta level after some brief questions, if that would be useful at this point. I'm conscious of time, so I don't want to sort of push you too far, in the content before we're able to get some feedback from you or questions if you want to ask them. So, Melissa, it'd be great if anyone that's interested in asking questions for the next 10 minutes would come forward. And if you don't have questions, that's also absolutely fine. I've got more, to speak to, and we can follow on with questions later. So I'll wait for a moment to see. Okay, please do post any questions in the chat as we're going, or let me know.
There's a question there in the chat now.
Excellent. How do you go about writing marking criteria for projects that span multiple modules? So that's a really great question. So that gets right to the nub of it, because and what I'll showcase in a moment is the way in which we start to develop these projects. It's very much about thinking with the learning outcomes in mind, obviously, but also then how that you can then bridge to the specific context of each of those project work, the project work that students are running with. So I'll show you in a moment how we work with a system to incorporate that. The marking criteria we're not just inheriting it, I suppose, but it's part of a developmental process that it continues. So the rubrics that we've used for our practice have stayed the same, even though, well, not completely the same, but they've held their base, let's say, around each disciplinary area, and then can be applied in that project work. And then that project work, is then specifically assessed within the scope of, let's say, dance, or the scope of music. Within that, I can see, Anne, you also. So are you still delivering 3 modules separately within this mode, or do you just set them off on their projects and apply what they've learned? So it depends on the level is the answer of that. So at level 3, things are a little more prescribed, and then we move to level 4 and level 5, and the development of the project work becomes much more open, so that students are able to create the kind of scope of shape the scope of their projects. The structure of the curriculum is that we have 3 modules per term, and they're 20 credit modules each, and so six per year. And in Sound of Music, for example, we're delivering 4 projects per term. So across that 3 module structure, there are 4 projects that sit on top, and I'll show how we coordinate that assessment process in a moment. So yeah, so the assessed portfolio exists independently of the modules. It does, but each of the projects allocates learning outcomes from each of those 3 modules, which I'll show you shortly. So the idea is that you have a project that you design from the beginning, and you select which learning outcomes from each of those 3 modules in each term you're going to assess. And then the distribution of those learning outcomes within the projects, we're managing that overall as a course team to make sure that all learning outcomes are covered, none are assessed too often, and there's a process for working out what the overall grade is for each of the learning outcomes. And I won't describe it too much more, because I'm going to show that process in a moment. One of the things that's really important about this is that this is actually the pivotal thing. It's the pivotal sort of mechanism that enables potentially much greater levels of agency for students. So I will just quickly then move, if everyone's happy, and we can come back to some other questions, because I think if I can show you some of that, I'll move through some of this framework as we go. And I might jump back to this, but I wanted to just chart some of the course of this. In the Meta-Praxis project, and I'll come back to your questions now. So Angela, yes, I'll come back to that in a moment. In the Meta-Praxis project, the idea with this was that a school team would inherit the structure. So the idea of the Meta-Praxis is very much about practice, is this integration of practice and theory, and reflection and action. We think about Frere's concepts of praxis. But the meta aspect, again, is this kind of reflective space. So it's very much about self-referential, it's about metacognition, self-awareness, self-efficacy, and so on. And Rose Lukin's work in meta-intelligence, for example, is also influential in this. So this framework that was established comprises 4 foundational elements. Firstly, integrated disciplinary, transversal and complex capabilities selected by each school, and that could be changed and adapted as they went. A metaspace, a sort of virtual, literal or concrete or abstract concept of a space, but something that could hold or be an interdisciplinary context within which to integrate and develop and apply these capabilities. And then concept of reflexive narration of learning, so students capturing their work and also teachers in the projects capturing their work in multimodal portfolios of impact. And that idea of impact is very much one about being open, rather than it's an open system of assessment rather than a closed system of assessment. So we're not only looking for similarity in the results, we're looking for equivalence and looking to find that and dealing with the complexity of that as a result, which again points back to some of the issues that are being raised already. And then thinking about how we map that, so impact mapping as a concept for how we might recognize learning and how it's occurred and what its opportunity is and what its potential is across multiple domains. So we're not only thinking about it in terms of an academic domain or a cognitive domain. It's very much about social, cultural, ecological, technological, ethical. We can move to all sorts of dimensions there. So the model has a diagram, the idea that you're integrating skills within a collaborative interdisciplinary project, much the same as the pattern at UEL, and then that is then captured by a portfolio which you're mapping. And in the project, we had this idea that these sort of terms of reference to self-regulate project work. So looking at what levels of agency are there, how are things being led, how do we maintain rigor? And again, this points to this idea of this tension between being very open and dynamic, but also needing to come down to some fixed points around what students have achieved. And then there's a question about, well, how fixed do those points need to be if we're thinking about things in an equivalent system or a system of equivalence rather than one of uniformity and similarity. So that framework is one that I've then shared with multiple schools, so primary and secondary schools in South Australia, who have been developing within that model as a way of developing and innovating their curriculum structures. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about the Masters in Global Learning Futures after that. But I'll jump now to the project system. Sorry, I didn't want to jump through that quite so incrementally. So the project system is one that's online, so I need to just come out of that and just find my mouse and share another screen. Sorry, we're getting there. So this is a very empty space, but the idea with the project system is that we would be able to create projects and that this is very open and dynamic. So I'm going to be very, very quick with this, but so selecting different courses, a different term. I'm going to just call this one CALT for now. Pretend there could be other collaborating courses that I might add into that, and I'll pretend that CALT's the project lead. So I'm pretending a lot here. I'm going to put CALT in, and this is possibly the worst project brief ever written. But the idea is that you design a project, you consider its context, types of activities, the outcomes and the impact that might be anticipated within this, and then the sorts of things that you'd expect, like resources, for example, and then allocating, identifying tasks and evidence relative to that task. So I'll just so that we can see it when it comes back to us. Once that's been written with much more time and effort and erudition than I've just given to it, I can then save and allocate learning outcomes, which is the sort of important bit here. So I have a project in mind, and then I go into that, and then the system identifies all of the learning outcomes from the 3 modules that I could potentially assess within that. And so then if I go and say, well, okay, what I'm interested in this case is, well, it's the numbers 1 and 2 each time, because I'm not going to spend too much time. You understand the structure of this and the process, without needing to get too much into the learning outcomes. But with those learning outcomes, you can see again that they're quite open. So evaluate research methods relative to creative practice. Here we might have summarized key theories and concepts of the 20th and 21st centuries relevant to their or your creative collaborative practice. So again, something that then is quite open that I want to be assessing. And in this, where I've written a task, I would identify specifically as part of that task how that task relates to one of the learning outcomes below. So it's not just the learning outcomes assessed in the project, that's also then duplicated here, so that again we're tying evidence to the way in which the students are being assessed. And so then I could save that. So once I've saved that, I can then look at it somewhere else. So I have a project brief that then is that. And so now I've just created Celt, and you can see there that then it has those learning outcomes listed. Now that's nothing radical in many ways. When it comes to assessing a project, one thing I probably cannot show you without revealing a student, which I won't do in this session, but I'll do it for myself, and you'll have to imagine something. So I load the project, and I have the project brief in front of me, and then I can select a student from the list, and I happen to be this one, this binary student here, and I could load the assessment. So in loading that assessment, this is where the student's portfolio would be. So an online website that they produced, and I can then see review that website as I'm live in the space, and assign marks against that for each individual learning outcome, and add feedback for the project and some feedback for the 2 key elements, so the practice and the coursework portfolio aspects, making reference to the rubrics that I mentioned to you earlier. So that process, I'm going to stop presenting this part really, but you can see that I won't reveal any student information here, but you can see that from the assessment briefs, we've then got quite a few different ones. So for example, Imaginary Productions is a real assessment, and this has got much more information about how students would then achieve that and what the requirements of that brief are. There is then an opportunity, which I'll show in my presentation rather than here, to sort of look at how those different projects combine. And so for a particular student, it's been anonymized here. You can see then that the combination of their learning outcomes that have been allocated for each of those projects results in overall grades for those modules for each of the coursework elements. So that you get this sort of combination of project practice resulting in an overall grade. And the basis for that is for any single learning outcome, the student receives the highest grade that they've achieved across the project work, providing that the submissions have been made, so that we don't have a student submitting just one project and then receiving full marks for that, where it's a quarter of what they should have submitted. So there's a way of calculating that. So that's an opportunity, and I'll pause again because I think there's some questions coming up. So yes, do you share FHEQ type descriptors for benchmark generic standards for learning? Yes, so the references for benchmarking for each course exist within our validation documentation for each of the courses. So each separate disciplinary area or course type is benchmarked against those. And those are how we derive the rubrics, and making sure that our program learning outcomes are also met. And does it reduce the incidence of is this going to be assessed? It does, in the sense that students are much more focused on on the practice and less focused on the assessment, but because the practice is the level of orientation we've given to them. What's most important for us is that students are able to articulate their practice as musicians or as artists within the music writing and performance area, and not necessarily thinking about only meeting the assessment criteria within a particular module. It also means that there are often multiple opportunities to repeat the same learning outcome within a portfolio, and not to over-assess the learning outcomes. But if one of the learning outcomes is about presenting their work to a professional level, for example, then that is something that could be achieved cumulatively across each of those different projects, then represented in a final portfolio. One of the opportunities that I've talked about in this, and there are two key ones really, is that this project approach enables us to design projects that that float across a fixed module pattern. The module pattern is it's sort of metatypical, so that it can host lots of different types of projects from different disciplinary areas, but within the same sort of broad scope. So arts and creative industries as a school, music, writing and performance as a cluster. But the benefit there is that we don't have to revalidate completely to nuance our delivery. And this is something that we're doing within the university, but also this applies to some of our partners. And one of the interesting sort of bits about the architecture of this is that old modules that would have coursework elements within them have shifted. So those coursework elements have again become quite generic and quite open, but in a way that the content of that has scaled to be bigger than modules. So in a way, we've taken old coursework elements and scaled them up so that they're bigger than modules, and in fact they now span 3 modules. But one of the opportunities is that it doesn't have to be that way. So a project could still be 1 module big, or 2 modules big, or 1.5 modules big. The scale of it is not necessarily fixed. The only thing that fixes it, of course, is that we need to cover all learning outcomes across the scope of all modules per term, but that's achievable within the way that we're delivering it. For our partners, and these are some of the partners that are either beginning to, as new partners, or already practicing this, Metropolitan College in Greece, MC, are in their music degree that we validate, is also applying the project model, which means that they can create projects that are nuanced for their context, but which still can be assessed within the same structure. And of course, we're going through the same process of academic link tutor, sort of collaboration there, and also external examining. So it's ratified, and it still exists within the quality process. It just enables us to be more nuanced in the way that we're delivering. Equally, United Development and Islington Music Workshop are new validated partners who will take on the project model, and that enables us to look, in one case, more towards sort of music business aspects, and in another case, more towards studio production processes. But part of this has also been the development of the Masters in Global Learning Futures, which is a way of accrediting the practice of learning innovation for teachers within the meta practice and the agency projects, and also wider scope. And the opportunity there has been linked to the Association of Independent Schools. So we have a partnership with them that enables teachers to pick up individual modules or a whole set of modules to complete the Masters. The idea is that it's sort of micro-credentialed in bigger chunks than really micro, I suppose. But it's not macro-credential. Well, it's macro and micro-credential. And the idea is that the teachers could pick up a module at a time. And we also have teachers in FE institutions here, for example, taking that as well as a way of accrediting innovation work within their learning contexts. And more broadly, we're starting to develop a partnership with Western Sydney University, which will also span the arts and so learning design with the School of Education here as well. And in a way, you know, there's this idea of a learning ecosystem that's really important to us. And this is a absolutely perplexing image. But the idea is that it showcases how some of these partnerships might operate, and I won't take you through all of it, but UEL sits here, and at all of these different levels, there are interconnections with different partnerships, either learning organisations. So here we have a partnership with UD at level 3 and level 4, but we also have opportunities potentially then to link at level 7 as a kind of professional development platform, and similarly with other partnerships as well. So we've got multiple links at different levels, and these also then sit potentially through partnership with other industry areas. And some of these exist, some of these are future ideas, but this is a concept of a learning ecosystem, is that we embed industry relationships that are better enabled by a more dynamic way of working within the curriculum structure. Lastly, I really just wanted to bring us back to this idea, and this is not necessarily this particular interface, but this idea of students being able to kind of change the rules as one of the moves of the game. And the idea for me with that is that imagine a slightly different interface, and it may be that you haven't quite fully captured the scope of this project model at the moment, but imagine this slightly different interface where a student could say, okay, well, I want to be assessed in this way. This is the scope of my project. I'm going to design a project. I'm a level 5 music technology, music performance production student, and it's term 1, and I've got a concept, an idea for a project that I'm going to write. And I'm going to be the project leader. I've got some other collaborators. And this is the context of my work. These are the activities that I foresee. This is my project plan. These are the anticipated outcomes and impact. These are the resources and so on. Maybe it's not task, it's much more about these sort of key components. And this would be something that maybe at level 4, level 5 is a kind of negotiation between the lecturer and the student. But the student could then carry on. Oh, goodness knows what I've called this. I've got to get rid of these later. This one's called test. And then I, as a student, could say, okay, well, actually in this project, this is where I want to look at my disciplinary skill sets, and I'm going to look at how I've developed and integrated a range of practical and creative skills in music performance. How I'm going to evaluate the emergent modes of collaboration within that. I'm a band member in a group, and that's what we're doing. We're making some songs. We're going to do a performance. I'm identifying the specialist roles and key skill sets. I'm going to evaluate that process, and then I'm going to present that in a portfolio, and that's done. So then I've got my test project. Now this would be a different interface. But the idea is that then I, as a student, would have a set of briefs that's specific to me. I'm sort of going around the wrong way here, or maybe I didn't quite manage to put it in the right place. Oh no, those amongst you quicker than me will have realised I did it at level 5. Here we go, so test. So then I've got a completely empty project, but the point is that I, as a student, can then pull that together, and then I, as a lecturer, plus the student in combination, could be the people that assess that. And perhaps as students develop better sort of metacognitive and awareness of the assessment process, awareness of how those learning outcomes could be assessed relative to benchmarks, we then could go through a process of students self-creating projects, allocating learning outcomes, and then through negotiation, through a kind of collaborative process of recognizing that learning, that they're then self-assessing or peer assessing, and that we as lecturers, we as teachers, are then in a process of moderation. We're moderating that process. We're moderating the process of how students are able to design their work, allocate learning outcomes and appropriately, and assess them. And again, I can't really go into view grades on a live system, but the idea is that, of course, that what you end up with then is a whole series of sort of portfolios and their assessed items and projects, rather, as a set of documentation. And the next stage for us in this is in the current system to give students login access so that they can, through login, can then access their project briefs, their assessments, and to view their assessment process, but also then to shift that then so students are able to start to create their own. And this may be something, I mean, I'm teaching at level 7 at the moment where that's absolutely relevant. It's exactly what students are already doing. But it'd be really interesting to see what that looks like at levels 3 and upwards, and the extent to which that needs to be scaffolded to facilitate that process. Obviously something we would look into as a sort of research process. But I think that certainly speaks to the first image that I came up with, or pretty much the first, in my presentation. Sorry, there we go. So it's not this one, because this one is altogether not as clear. But if I go back to the locus of control image here, this idea of who's directing the learning process is a really interesting question, I think, which I could get there much more coherently than I am. Sorry, slight issue. Here we go. So, you know, this idea with this curriculum design process is well, where do we sit? How do we manage a process where students are not only self-directing their own project work and their own practice, but how do we manage a process that accepts the dynamic quality of students self-directing curriculum design, that is a diverse range of experience for students, where we recognise that there's going to be some divergence in our groups. We don't have a group of students that's all doing the same thing at the same point in time. And of course, that's been quite similar for the last couple of years. You know, this asynchronous approach, you know, is not unfamiliar to us. And in this way, what I think is possibly one of the strongest aspects here is that in the same way that we're managing this within our own school, we may well then be able to think about that as a way that we manage our partnerships as a learning ecosystem between the university and its different partners. And certainly it's a way of moving from a system that is based around uniformity, everyone doing pretty much the same thing. And, you know, obviously that's a sort of archaic view of education 1.0 perhaps. But if we're in education 4.0 that recognises divergence and recognises the personalised approaches that are necessary at primary, secondary and tertiary levels, then we've got to start to think about things in terms of their equivalence. We can't only have the same assessment processes. We can't necessarily only hold to the same structural features. And part of this is going to be about shifting our values and the principles by which these sort of structures are kind of cemented in many ways. So thank you very much for listening and being part of the presentation. I'd like to use the last 10 minutes, I think, to see if there are any other questions that people have. And I will share in the chat both papers that I mentioned. They are coming up. I will show you where they are very shortly. Having managed to get my mouse working. So these are the two papers. Learning on Purpose, 10 Lessons in Placing Student Agency at the Heart of Schools by Charles Leadbeater, and Learning in a Floating World of Disciplines, Reflections on the Meta Practice project by me. We have been, Charles and I have been sort of critical partners to each, so there's a shared forward in Charlie's paper and a shared afterward in mine that really pull those things together. And I'd be very happy to you know, pass on those papers, but also to field any questions now. And please do contact me maybe individually, directly, or through Melissa, through Kelp, if you'd like to carry on the conversation. So any further questions, please let me know.
I think there's a few questions in the chat. I think one from Angela.
Excellent. Could it
yes.
be done portfolio stage, effective learning outcomes attached to project defined? Sorry, Yes, I think you could do it retrospectively. So if a student created their own portfolio and then you looked at it in reverse, I think the issue with that might be that the opportunities to facilitate that process are not necessarily reduced, but that's more difficult because how you scaffold that as you go along. In a way, you've got a project brief that the students to develop themselves, or you've negotiated with them. So there's always a reference point, and of course that can be adapted. But I think certainly one of the things that speaks to that, I think, is this idea that there are artifacts of a learning process that we don't always capture within the frame of teaching and learning, within the frame of the curriculum. So what about bringing things in that are external, that are supplementary to what is the planned process? And one of the key things in my paper is, it talks about this idea of, the planned versus the emergent learning impact. So there are things that we plan for all the time, and then there are things that emerge, but often we negate the things that emerge. And so perhaps that's what speaks to what your question is getting at, Angela, which is that, surely we should be able to look at other aspects of a student's learning experience or creative experience and be able to credit those and recognise those as having impact as well. So I'm probably not going in the right order here, but so Eleanor, you asked if you're working with multiple disciplines, all working on the same project in their specific mediums, how does that work when allocating and marking? So the way that would work is that the way that we validated the projects, the modules, is within clusters. So there are some clusters that are fairly closely connected. So we have a media cluster, we have a fashion cluster, we have a music writing and performance cluster, for example. So within those, you can share, there are shared modules. There are also program-specific modules, which are the skills modules. So there is an element of specificity there. If you were working, let's say I want to do a sound project with the School of Architecture, or an architecture course, we would write independent projects that connected, so that we would probably have the same thematic structural features to those two projects, but then come away and be assessed specifically within those areas of those clusters. But I think so the project could have the same name, it could have the same contextual scope, but it would just be that we're operating perhaps in a more multidisciplinary way. But what I find fascinating is the idea of, well, what is a transdisciplinary project that combines dance, architecture, sound design, and fashion, or a business, for example? How would we start to then coordinate that? Which isn't really an answer, I know, but there are going to be some close connections that exploit natural affinities. There are going to be some quite diverse and loose connections where you need, the links are not going to be as fixed, but perhaps there are still mutual areas of, practice within that. Great. Well, if there are no more questions, and I totally agree, Angela, the emergent is sometimes the gold. Absolutely. For me, there's that sort of idea of exploratory work that you haven't planned really is the thing, and that's what you're trying to get to. The concept in my paper is about, well, how as teachers do we plan for emergence? So how do you establish the conditions for emergent practice? You can't always directly teach that. In fact, you can't didactically teach emergence, but what you can do is establish the conditions, and it's how we do that that's I think really important. Thank you, Eleanor. Great, you enjoyed that, and also Tamara.
Thank you, Michael,
for
the session. If you have any more questions, or if you have any more questions later on, you can get in touch with me or get in touch with Michael directly, and then we'll get back to you.
And Melissa, shall I, if I add this to the chat, I guess people who have been on the meeting will be able to access that later.
Yes, and then I can email people otherwise as well. Same as.
Great, that'd be great. Thank you.
That's absolutely fine. And then, yeah, if it's okay with you, then we can share the recording as well.
Absolutely, we're very, very happy to do that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Michael, for the presentation. Very interesting. And thanks everyone for being here, and we look forward to seeing you soon.